Thank you very much, Hillel. It's a real honor to be here. It's also very humbling. I'm someone who, unlike my father, has never lived in a tyranny, has never been imprisoned, has never suffered torture. I live in a country where I can speak my mind, where I can criticize my government without fearing for repression. That is, of course, not the case for most of the speakers here. But of course, there are many challenges to global human rights. We've heard about them today. I'd like to focus on some institutional and conceptual ones and how I think that democracies, in particular European democracies, are failing to heed that challenge. And one of those challenges is what I would call human rights proliferation, meaning simply that the concept of human rights has been expanded to the point where human rights often no longer demark the difference between dictatorships and democracies, between freedom and tyranny. And that development you can see quite clearly here in this town in Geneva when the Human Rights Council is assembled. You also see it at the General Assembly. And it is very often championed by non-free states, such as, for instance, Cuba, who prefer to speak, for instance, about the right to international solidarity rather than freedom of expression, assembly, due process, and so on. And so at the Universal Periodic Review, for instance, you see dictatorships lining up to praise each other. Now let me quote what Cuba said about North Korea. We've just heard of what happens in North Korea, but Cuba said of North Korea that it works to consolidate a socialist and just society which guarantees equality and social justice. This is North Korea being praised here in Geneva during the UPR, which is, of course, supposed to be a human rights exam for each and every UN member state. Of course, one favor is worth another, and so when it was Cuba's time to go before the UPR, you had North Korea returning the favor, saying that Cuba should work through the UN mechanism in progressive development of the third generation of human rights, particularly international solidarity, which, of course, is one of the rights that Cuba is championing, and which, of course, means absolutely nothing. And this, of course, all happens at the expense of scrutiny of real human rights violations. At the Human Rights Council, millions of dollars are being spent on special procedures, mandates for experts that do nothing to advance basic human rights. In 2012, only 24% of the funds for special procedures were spent on civil and political rights. Now, the result of that is, of course, a lack of critical scrutiny of dictatorships. Take, for instance, the Special Rapporteur on Cultural Rights, who's spending well over $1 million trying to, quote, identify main challenges and obstacles posed by advertising and marketing practices to the enjoyment of cultural rights. Or the Rapporteur on the Right to Health, who, when in Syria in 2010, 6 months before the uprisings that caused the current slaughter, criticized the regime for the high prevalence of tobacco smoking, not its torture chambers. Is that really what we prioritize in a world where, as we see in the latest Freedom House report, civil and political freedoms are in the decline for the 8th year in a row, where we see ethnic cleansing in the Central African Republic, violent crackdowns on protesters in Venezuela, Ukraine, and Iran that executes poets? I think we have our priorities wrong. Unfortunately, democracies are too often timid about this development. I think we live in an age with an unprecedented vacuum of moral leadership, one where democracies are reactive, are on the defense rather than setting the agenda. It's funny that President Obama often goes to European countries and he says that these countries, whether it's Denmark, Ireland, or the Netherlands, punch above their own weight. But I think that when it comes to human rights, the EU and its member states punch considerably below their own weight. For instance, here in Geneva, where there is too much focus on what I would call the culture of consensus, we all have to agree and get along, and let's not rock the boat. But all too often, the EU agreement means the lowest common denominator rather than a united principle stand for human rights. And I think it's quite important that European countries should forsake the idea of EU unity at all costs. If you can't reach consensus on strong positions, like-minded countries should break out and speak up. I think it's better that the Netherlands, the UK, go together with the US and Canada, other like-minded countries, and try to table strong resolutions, even if they lose. If they can't get the support, voice their criticism. That's what the Human Rights Council is there for, rather than to settle for meaningless or weak resolutions that only produce paper indifference and cynicism. Let's go back to what Hillel talked about the voting patterns during the last Human Rights Council elections. Vietnam was elected with 184 votes. So my math is pretty poor, but if we take the same assumptions as in your, then it would be something like 22 EU states that voted for Vietnam. What kind of message does that send to Vietnam? Does it send a message from EU states that we really care about what's going on inside your country, or does it send the signal, do whatever you want, we don't really care? China received 176 votes, the same as Putin's Russia. Cuba, 148, Saudi Arabia, 140, Algeria, 164. That tells you something about a lack of moral leadership, and that democracies as well really are failing to live up to their moral principles. Of course, Western and other states may not have the numbers to get automatic majorities in the Human Rights Council or the General Assembly. We've seen some surveys documenting how the influence of the EU has been going down. But they do have what we could call the power of the purse. In 2012, the Western and other groups contributed over 90 million to the OHCHR in voluntary donations. By comparison, the other 4 regional groups combined contributed just over 10 million. The Western and other groups paid 94% of the total contributions earmarked for special procedures in 2012, 88% of the total extra budgetary funds available for special procedures. So therefore, I think the message should be, if you wish to dilute the system with meaningless rights that whitewash the North Koreas, the Cubas, and Saudi Arabias of this world, we're not going to pay for it. Also, my organization drafted a bill and convinced a political party in Denmark to table it, which would prohibit the Danish government for voting for countries that commit gross and systematic violations of human rights for membership on UN human rights related bodies. Now, it failed, didn't pass, but we managed to have 3 parties both from the right and the left that voted in favor of it, and we've had other parliamentarians in Norway, in the UK, express an interest in that. And I urge all of you to take up the same idea, to petition your parliamentarians to have them table that. I'll warn you that your foreign services will go ballistic. They don't like the ideas of not being able to horse trade in secret here in the corridors of Geneva and New York, but I think it's worthwhile pursuing that. And also, there will be some who play the post-colonial discourse, saying that how can Western states be activists in human rights? Isn't this a kind of neo-imperialism? But I would say this: how can you atone for wrongs committed in the past by ignoring wrongs committed in the present? Thank you very much.